I mentioned that this is our last teaching time in the book of the Exodus. We are not going all the way through the book of the Exodus because we're not. So we're going to stop here. We're in 13 and 14, Exodus chapter 13 and 14. So if you have a Bible with you or an app on your phone or something you want to follow along with us, that's kind of where we're going to be settling in here. Let me grab a drink quick before my throat dries up. Thank you for that. But we are teaching through here the end of this part of the sermon series, and this will get to the crossing of the Red Sea. You may be familiar with this part of the story, or maybe in the movies that you've seen. But in the crossing of the Red Sea, what we see is the complete departure of the old and an entrance into a new life with God as their one true living God that they worship and they adore, the Hebrew people. So in the crossing of the Red Sea, it is this miraculous event that literally leaves behind the old and embarks on this new life, this new union, friendship with the divine himself. And what we've said all the way along, all through this series here, is that the story of Exodus mirrors our story, that we can find our story in their story. This is not just some historical reference we look to, but we look to find our story caught up in their story and things that we can learn about how it is that we can live our life in divine friendship with Yahweh, leaving the old behind and embarking on a new unified life with God. There's so much in this story of Exodus, but so much even in these two chapters that we could spend the next hours and days and months even in investigating deeper in time. We don't have that much time, so I just simply want to relate to what it looks like for us to learn to live a divine friendship with God, a deep union with God. For what God is doing is delivering his people out of bondage and then into a new life. But that new life is a new life they're going to have to learn some things. They're going to have to learn how to live this life, freed from bondage, but now how to live. And even how to live is sometimes more difficult than just simply being freed from bondage. And what we will see in these few chapters is that God is establishing the way in which we are to live now that we have left the old and are embarking on the new. And so there's a few things I want us to highlight here in chapters 13 and 14 about what it looks like to live with this divine friendship, about how to grow in our life with God. And the first thing we see right at the very beginning in chapter 13 is that a life with God is a life that is devoted to him in both our work and our heart, in both what we do and our affections. We're no longer bound in slavery, but in a new life with God, we are to be devoted to God. We see this in both of these things here. So in Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, he says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Consecrate to me the firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal.'" The word here, to consecrate to me the very firstborn, that word means to set apart or to devote or to dedicate the very firstborn to God, the firstborn in both animal and human. And the firstborn would represent our whole livelihood in recognition that all that we have, both our families, our work environment, our economics, our financial abilities, all that we have is a gift from God, and we're to use it, to steward it for his glory. No longer are we using and interacting our life for Pharaoh's glory or for our glory, but our life is for God's glory. For we've been rescued and redeemed and delivered into a new way of life, and that life is to be devoted, set apart, consecrated for his glory. For when we live for his glory, we begin to experience the eternal fruitfulness that we've been designed for. Because, God says, because he has made provision for life through his death and through the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, then we approach our very livelihood, our work, our time, everything, we approach it with a reflection to give Him honor and give gratitude, thanksgiving for His work and His mercy in our life. So we no longer live for anyone else's glory, but our livelihood, our whole life is to be devoted. He says, consecrate for me the very firstborn of every womb, both man and animal. Consecrate, set apart, be devoted, dedicated for His glory. The New Testament would catch up on this theme, and the Apostle Paul would write about it this way in Romans chapter 12. He says, here's what I want you to do, God helping you. I want you to take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. This is what it means to have your life devoted or dedicated, consecrated for the Lord. Take your everyday working, going to school life, going to the grocery store. Take everything you do and do it in honor of God. Dedicate, devote your whole life. For life with God, union with God is not simply about escaping, escaping the bonds of slavery to sin, but it is embarking on a life with God, which means He is our highest priority. Because God knows that when you live for anything else or anyone else, it becomes idol worship, which is exactly what the Israelites were living under in Egypt, surrounded by gods and false idols around them that clamored for their attention and their highest priority. And God said, if you are going to live a sustainable, eternal, abundant kind of life in this land of flowing with milk and honey, you're going to need to dedicate your life not to Pharaoh or other gods or other idols, but to Him, that He would be your highest priority. And so He says, consecrate the very firstborn of your household for me. Worship the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Don't worship the things of this world or the things of Pharaoh or the things of anything else. But take your work and how you approach your work, not for your gain or for someone else's, but for the glory of God. That is how you live a life that is in eternal quality and of a depth of meaning and purpose. And this consecration of the firstborn was a very practical act that would demonstrate that the Hebrew people, God's people's whole life, would be dedicated for His glory. It was a significant act, for we know our significance finds its meaning when we live for Him and Him alone. In our contemporary context here, that means that when we live our life, our going to work, our going to the grocery store, our interactions with one another, we do it in a way that God would do it if He were us. And we set priorities, and we practically demonstrate a reliance on God to steward our work and even steward our finances for the glory of God. So when we come to worship, we come and we bring our tithes and our offerings, our financial gifts, not to pay bills or to keep lights on, but to steward our resources for the glory of God, to dedicate all that we are for His glory and His glory alone. It's a practical desire for us to recognize that all that we have, it belongs to God, and it stands as an example not only for us, but for those that come after us, where our highest priority is. If you look at Exodus chapter 13, slide down to verse 14. He says, in the days to come, when your son asks you, what does all this mean? This consecration, this devotion to the Lord, when we set things apart, when we bring our tithes and our offerings to the Lord, what does all this mean? Then you are to say to him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The reason that we bring our devotion through our work and through our tithes and our offerings, the reason is that when others look at us, we can say, because God has redeemed and delivered us, and everything we have is for His glory. Everything that we own and everything that we have been resourced with is to be used for His glory. So when people ask you, when your son and your daughter and your grandson, your granddaughter, your niece, your nephew ask you, what is it about this thing? Why is it that you're stewarding your resources that way? Then you can testify to the fact that God has indeed rescued and redeemed and delivered you from the hand of slavery. So this devotion is very practical. It involves our work and how we prioritize our resources and the stewarding of our resources. But it also has to do with our heart, our affection, our desires. God's going to interact with the Hebrew people, and He instructs them to actually change their calendars. We don't have time to get into it, but if you look at Exodus 13, the verses 3 through 10, He will describe the festival of unleavened bread. It's a whole week-long festival to remember God's deliverance and how He rescued the people out of slavery. The Passover meal was one meal, but the festival of unleavened bread was a whole week. And it wouldn't just be 1 week, for God's going to institute a whole different calendar of festivals and remembrances and meals and regular gatherings that the people of God are going to gather regularly to retell the story. And it's not just a once a week or once a month or once a year, but the entire calendar is taken over by God's story. Because God knows that what we spend the most time doing will affect our heart's affections, and it will change our heart's desires. Our love will begin to be consumed by what we spend the most time around, spend the most time doing. And if you and I don't have regular rhythms in our calendar to be reminded of God's glory, then our affections will drift towards the priorities of the prevailing culture. Our kids' schedules and sporting events and holidays that our work is doing and our work environment schedule, cultural things that go on in our culture. But how we spend our time reflects our value and our heart's affection and what we love. And if our life with God is relegated to one of the margins of our calendar, of our schedule, then it will be the first thing that is sacrificed when life gets too busy. And we will not experience the joy and the peace and the abundance that deep life with God provides. But we're going to need to take intentional steps with our calendar to make sure that our schedule reflects a heart that is devoted to God. For if we don't get a hold of our calendar, then we will drift away by what is immediately before us, not what is eternally important. In a life of divine friendship with God, we live devoted to God, not only in our resources, not only in our work, but in our time. In our time, we prioritize our time with God, that it takes highest priority, and other schedules move around our time with God. Other things move around because nothing is more important than my time with the Lord. So let me ask a redemptive question for you. Does our life demonstrate that kind of devotion? How we're stewarding our resources, does that reflect a devotion where God is my highest priority? Does how I steward and structure my time, my calendar, my schedule, does it reflect a honor and devotion of God where He is my highest priority? See, in our context in 2023, the idols of materialism and busyness threaten to choke out a joyful life with God. Materialism and busyness threaten to choke out the life that we've been given by God. And it will take a concerted, disciplined effort to be devoted, to consecrate the very first aspect of our work and of our time. Life devoted to God is one that's one to be devoted to Him in all things. But it is also, as we'll see here in Exodus, one that is under the guidance of God in our daily life. Look again at Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though it was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. And skip down verse, 21. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they would travel by day or night. There are two things I want you to notice about God's guidance here. The first is that God's guidance for our life with Him is always gracious. Gracious. Rather than going the shortest route, God leads them by a detour, right? And that is God's grace. For He knew something that the Israelites did not know. While they came out of Egypt physically ready for battle, they weren't emotionally, spiritually, or relationally ready for that. And so He detours them because He's gracious. He knows something they do not know. And this is a fascinating truth for us. That we can grow in our life and our dependence on God. We can trust Him. Even when you can't see His hand, you can trust His heart. Even when you can't see His hand of what He is doing, His guidance is always gracious for what is best for us. And God uses, and sometimes God causes detours in our life. And while we may not like the detours, He uses those detours to produce maturity in us that otherwise we would not have if we just got the short road. And while it's certainly not easy for us to wait for the guidance of the Lord, and certainly is not always the timing that we would like, we can trust His heart, for His guidance is always gracious for us, leading in a way that produces maturity and dependence on Him. But also I want you to notice how He guides the Israelites, how He guides them. He guides them through His presence, His daily presence. We're told by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar by fire by night, so that they can walk in His presence both day and night. He's not gathering them together for a weekly gathering and then sending them out on their own. Have fun storming the castle. He doesn't do that. It's a daily, regular presence of God that is going to guide them graciously, but ever present with His presence by day and by night. And we ought to be disciplined in this, to not simply come for a weekly tune-up or a once-a-year gathering or a once-a-year spiritual high that we go on, but we learn and we discipline ourselves for a life of long obedience in the same direction. We follow after a God who is by day and by night eternally graciously present. So we discipline ourselves to be aware of His presence on an ongoing, everyday, moment by moment activity. Aware of God's presence, moment by moment, not weekly, not monthly, but moment by moment. And here I want to give you a couple suggestions. Maybe you want to do one of these this week to begin to be aware of the presence of God moment by moment with you to guide you along the way. And the first suggestion is to have an aspect of breath prayer through your day. We've talked about this a lot, you may have remembered, but a breath prayer is just simply a short prayer that you can say in rhythm of your breath. And you just take a deep breath throughout your day. And when you inhale, you simply say, "My life." And as you exhale, you say, "In your hands." My life in your hands. My life in your hands. Throughout your day, and allow the breath and the rhythm of your breath to remind you of the ever guidance and gracious guidance of the presence of God. You might want to try that this week. But a second practice I'm going to suggest for you is something, and I don't know what to call this, is what I call it, so I'll give it to you. It's called holy imagination. Holy imagination. I've been doing this as of recently, but I spend about 5 minutes in the mornings, and I use my imagination to visibly think through my day. I have almost an out-of-body experience where I watch myself. I'm not crazy. Don't go crazy, right? But I begin to watch myself get into my car and drive to the church, and where I'm coming into the parking lot, going around the roundabout, and I'm seeing who I'm seeing as I'm literally imagining myself go out throughout my day. And as I imagine my actual steps through the day, I imagine the presence of God being right next to me as I go through my day. And I use my imagination to literally think through my day. It only takes me about 5 minutes, but in that I use my imagination. I invite the presence of God. And after that 5 minutes, I leave and I simply say a simple prayer saying, God, would you give me those eyes as I go through today? So you might want to try one of those this week. A breath prayer, my life in your hands, or holy imagination for 5 minutes. And think about your day and the presence of God with you. And maybe that would remind you of the gracious guidance of the presence of God in a moment-by-moment experience throughout your day. Well, one final thing that we can see in this experience at the Red Sea, and that is that we are protected by God in our life with Him. Pharaoh pursues the Israelites with 600 of his best chariots, and the Israelites are fearful. They assume they're going to die. After all, this is the world's most powerful army is coming after them, and they know that they're just simply going to die. They're no match for them, and so fear grips them. And what you see in this moment as they are on the shore of the Red Sea and Egypt's army is crowding in on them is the residual effects of their old life before deliverance, because the enemy still tries to exert control over them. The enemy still tries to exert fear and insecurities and doubt in them. And the same is true for us. The same is true in our life with God. That while we may have come to a decision and put our faith in Jesus and been delivered from sin, the enemy still tries to exert control over us. The enemy still tries to exert control and power over us. And that usually comes in the way of fear and insecurity and doubt. Doubt of God's goodness, doubt of God's provision, doubt of our own abilities. For we continually hear those old tapes in our mind of all the times when we've messed up and all the times when we can never be good enough. And that insecurity and that doubt plays again, and we hear the doubtful voice of the enemy that says, maybe God's grace will dry up one day and you'll have gone too far. While we may have been delivered at one time, we still struggle with those internal voices in our own heart. The enemy of our soul is still trying to control us by fear and doubt and insecurity. And so what do you do with that? What do you do when you find yourself overwhelmed with those past doubts and fears? What did the Israelites do? When they're on the shoreline of the Red Sea and the doubts and all the fears crushing in on them from their past life, what did they do? Well, in Exodus chapter 14, we get the answer. Exodus 14, verses 13 to 14. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, but stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Whole sermons could be given on that little verse right there. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. A resolute faith in the God who fights for us. Confidence in His ability to do what we cannot do. And that's exactly what the Hebrew people experienced. Moses stretches out his hand and miraculously the Red Sea parts. And God's people walk through on dry ground. And when the Egyptian people try to pursue, the Red Sea envelops them and they drown. God is the one who will protect them. He is the one who will fight for them. They only need to be still. God is the one who will bring ultimate completion to our deliverance. We only need to have resolute confidence and faith in Him. Faith in God is a long obedience in the same direction, but it is disciplining ourselves in that way, in a way that is learning to be still in His presence with a steadfast hope that stands firm in the most troubling of circumstances, that we can trust God. And we do that because we are confident in the power of the one who fights for us. The one who fights for us. But if we're going to be delivered from the old and led into a new way of living, we have to discipline, train ourselves to learn how to live that way. For it doesn't happen overnight. And it won't happen for the Hebrew people, by the way. For they will spend the next 40 years wandering around before they are ready. It will take time of dedicated discipline, of maturity along the way. But along the way, we follow the one who protects us, the one who guides us, the one who's made provisions for us. So as a way to kind of wrap up this series, let me close with a few questions for us to consider in our developing life with God, as our life responds to His work of deliverance, of His sacrificial lamb that has paid the price for us to live into this new life. Can I ask a few questions for us just to wrap up? See, if we are struggling with fear and insecurities or old habits that are seeking to maintain control in our life, can I suggest that what we learn from the story of the Exodus is there ought to be a clear departure from the old, a clear departure from the old and a learning of the new, a learning of the new life. So does our life reflect that? Does our life reflect a willingness to learn, to change direction, and to learn to devote ourselves in all of our time, our resources, our attention? Does our life reflect a willingness to change direction, to leave the old and to go towards the new? Or does our life reflect a holding on to the old? Let me just hold on to this too. I'll have that, but let me just hold on to this. And in the story of the Exodus, there is no holding on to old idols and false gods. There's a complete departure from false idols and false gods and a devotion to the one true living Yahweh. Does our life reflect that? Does our attention, does our calendar, does our schedule reflect a willingness to be guided by His gracious presence and to be aware of that in our life? And when we experience a complete turning away from false idols and idol worship, we will experience what the Lord has done for us and His protection and His deliverance. And it will bring a peace that transcends all understanding and a joy that nothing in this world could ever take away. But we have to be willing to have a clear break from the old idols. And in our context, in our world, the idols of materialism and busyness are two of the highest idols that seek to choke out our life with God. Are we willing to change direction and to be fully devoted in those areas to experience the life that God has wired us up for? A land flowing with milk and honey, as the story of Exodus would tell us. Before I pray and before I invite Stan and the worship team to come forward, I just want to sit with that for a second. Spend maybe 10 seconds just sitting with that. Where's the Lord asking you to hold on to? Is there a truth? Is there a piece of life that God is inviting you to a more deeper experience with Him? Stronger devotion to Him? What part do you want to hold on to and take with you this morning? Maybe we just spend 10 seconds just in quiet, just to think, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to respond to the story of the Exodus? and how I've seen my life in this. We'll take 10 seconds and then I'll pray. Father, we are humbled by your sacrifice for us. And we desire to live a new life in the abundant land flowing with milk and honey. But we know we need to have a complete departure of our old. Give us the courage to let go of the false idols and the worship of other gods, that we may take up this life with you. Grateful for the provision and the protection and the miraculous hand that you have brought us out of slavery and out of sin. Guide us and draw our attention to your ever-present life with us. We want to know you in deeper ways. It's in your name we pray. Amen.